All right, that's great. All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon and for bearing with us through some slight technology snaggles. I really look forward to seeing you all in person next year and not speaking into the abyss. So Matt and I are going to talk to you all about the wonderful reports that he's written, that he and Shirley have worked on today. Can you go ahead and advance, Matt? I'm sorry. So at History Colorado, we have been starting for the last year or so all of our talks with a land acknowledgement. So we're going to go ahead and do that today as well. In the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them and we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. Thanks. Okay, so hi, it's really good to have you all here today. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Holly Norton. I'm the Colorado State Archaeologist, and I'm here with my colleague, Matt Goebel from Clarion Associates to talk about the forthcoming report, Archaeology for a Changing Colorado. As many of you probably know, since 2002, History Colorado has produced a series of reports, roughly every 5 years or so, on the economic benefits of brick and mortar historic preservation. In 2016, with the publication of the latest iteration of that report, Preservation for a Changing Colorado, we recognized that there was a huge gap in understanding the economic impacts of archaeology in the state. It didn't take long to identify really that as a discipline and an industry, we're missing those reports and data about the tangible benefits of our discipline across the country. So back in 2016, 2017, I spoke with our partners, Shirley Powell at Crow Canyon Archaeological Center and Matt, and Clarion Associates, for those of you who may not be familiar, is a land use consulting firm based here in Denver. And it is the same firm who's produced the historic preservation report. So they're really familiar with kind of the breadth of historical preservation and archaeological work that we do across the state. And so we wanted to figure out how to remedy this. So the ultimate purpose of this report is to identify what it means when we say we're doing archaeology in Colorado, and to identify effective means of communication, or effective means of communicating, the benefits of what we do to elected officials, grant funding agencies, and the public. Next, please. First and foremost, I do want to make it clear, I want to give credit where credit is due. This has really been the efforts of Matt and Shirley. So Shirley Powell couldn't be here today, so you guys are stuck with me talking at you for this. But they've really just done a phenomenal job. Clarion Associates and Crow Canyon have really done a Herculean task by identifying data sources to answer these questions about what our impacts are in this state. And also like why we should bother with archaeology. Ultimately, they have produced 2 reports. The first report is what we call the popular report. This is an easily accessible report that explains many of the various facets of our discipline and industry. It highlights the different people who do archaeology, different places where archaeology informs us about the past, and explains why what we do is relevant today. This is the report we'll largely be discussing today, but we'll also be touching on the technical report. And in all honesty, I think this is the report that many of you will want and need to really look at closely. In the technical report, Clarion discusses all the data sources, all the fancy like math and magic that they used to kind of dig down and get the numbers that illustrate the impact of our various projects. And they've looked at everything from like conferences to Section 106 projects to, museum visits, and how those positively impact local communities. Both of these reports are in their final days of editing. They will be available very, very, very soon. They just weren't quite ready for prime time today. But we really wanted to get this information out in front of you this year, since we will be releasing them shortly. I believe, and Matt can correct me on this, that we'll be printing a limited number of copies, but both reports will be publicly available on the dedicated website. And we request feedback, comments. We'll have an opportunity at the end of today's talk to discuss some of the things that we're going to bring up. But please, bring future feedback and comments and information back to us. And please share these reports widely. Use them for communicating with all the various audiences that we all interact with. I'm going to turn it back over to Matt to go into some more detail. I will be jumping back in to describe different aspects of the report later, so there'll be a little bit of a back and forth. Please.
All right, sounds good. Thanks, Holly. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thank you all for joining us for this discussion. Again, Matt Goebel from Clarion Associates. I just wanted to re-emphasize something that Holly just mentioned. These graphics on the screen they're still in draft form. We're going to have shiny new covers that say 2021 pretty soon for both the popular report and the technical report. We're just doing final editing on those. We're also going to be doing a big rollout for the URL of the website. We're still securing that right now, so I don't want to go down that road too far, but the website is going to be rolled out very quickly as well with the final documents. So everything you're seeing today is a bit of a teaser, but you'll be seeing it very soon, and you'll have access to the full data on the document. What we're going to do now for the next part of the report is start walking you through some of our findings, and we're going to do that by using some of the draft illustrations from the reports that are in progress. And Holly and I are going to walk through methodically based on really how the report is organized, just to give you a sense of the different things that we've covered. And oftentimes reports start with an executive summary. And so I've got a couple of screenshots up front just to give you some illustrations of how the report will be organized, and also what some of the major themes are that we've started to identify for archaeology in Colorado. Y'all are archaeologists, y'all know this stuff, but I think a lot of the audience for this report may be much less familiar with what archaeologists do and where archaeology actually takes place. And so we're very much gearing this report to a lay audience that needs to have an understanding of a lot of the nuts and bolts of the field. So we talk about, for example, on this slide, the fact that archaeology is statewide. The fact that you see projects, not just in the big flashy sites like Mesa Verde, but in small town museums. You see that, in the backyards of the Front Range. You see really across the state in communities of all sizes, archaeological activities taking place. And you can see at the bottom right of the slide, some of the highlighted projects that we've illustrated in this report. Throughout this presentation, we're going to be telling you about some of those case studies just to give you a flavor of what we've talked about. Some of the other things that we talk about in the executive summary are the numbers. This project originally generated as an economic benefits project, to talk about economic benefits of archaeology to complement the historic preservation benefits we've talked about in other reports. This gives you a flavor on these images here of some of the clip art that we've gotten, that we're developing, just to summarize some of the major archaeological numbers that contribute to state and local economies. And I'll go through more of the details of these in later slides as we get into some of the details. But right up front, we start to summarize just some of the big numbers in terms of overall direct spending, state and local taxes, jobs generated, etc. So there's a lot of numbers throughout this report. We hit the high points in the popular report, and we get into the methodology behind these in that technical report that Holly mentioned. So that's the executive summary. Now the report itself is organized as you see on the slide here. There's 4 big parts. There's an initial section which talks about what is archaeology, and again, we're trying to gear this towards a lay audience. So I'm a layman, I'm not an archaeologist, and so I was able to come into this, with a pretty fresh perspective and really try to ask some basic questions about who are archaeologists, what do you all do, what are the different parts of the field. And so this is something that's different from the preservation reports that we did. We didn't really talk about what is historic preservation, but here with the archaeology piece, we really wanted to provide a layman's summary of the field. So I'll talk about that. Then sections 2 and 3 are the heart of the report. In section 2, we talk about the overall landscape today. You know, what are all the different types of archaeology projects? How can we potentially quantify some of those economic benefits? And then in section 3, we look at the future, and we look at changing trends, changing dynamics in Colorado, everything from changing climate to changing population to changing land use patterns, and what is potentially the role of archaeology as it relates to some of those changing trends. And then finally, in section 4, we have, it's a resource guide talking about moving forward beyond this report into the future, and how can this report be used to lay a foundation for even better studies of archaeology in the future. So that's a big overview of where we're going with this report. Again, Holly and I are going to walk you through each of these just with a little bit more detail, and also some case studies to give you some of the flavor here. So with what is archaeology? Again, this is to explain what y'all do, you know, to the public at large, and to really start to illustrate some of the broader issues, like the broad range of specialties, you know, within the field of archaeology. The fact that, you know, archaeology is a subset of anthropology, and there's all those different types of subsets within archaeology that are shown on the right-hand side there. We have a number of pages that go through, you know, who is an archaeologist and the different types of day-to-day work that might be involved, you know, from the field work to research to, you know, working in a museum, for example, in the interpretation of archaeological exhibits. What do archaeologists do? And you can see there's a range of, you know, potential career paths shown there, and we talk about all those. We actually have 6 or 7 pages devoted to this stuff with a lot of pictures, really to try to give a sense, a flavor of who archaeologists are and what they do on a day-to-day basis. And one of the ways that we try to bring it to life is with some of our first case studies, like with Jason LaBelle. And so with this, I'll turn it back over to Holly.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. So to humanize archaeology, as Matt was saying, he and Shirley have included brief bios on a couple of archaeologists, such as this one of our own Jason LaBelle. And we all know Jason, so I won't go into depth of his mini CV here. But I will say that in other presentations to non-specialists, so we did present this report last month at Saving Places. You know, this kind of humanizing and bringing in individual people has allowed us an entree into being able to speak to the diversity of people who do archaeology and the diversity of topics that we study, or that we do compliance on, you know, whatever aspect of archaeology it is that we work on. I think this is a really important thing for us, to find ways to communicate to the public in a way that gives us faces and personalities. And it's a really important method of effective science communication. In establishing that trust with the public in experts. And I think as we have to increasingly kind of plead our case with decision makers or elected officials, it's important for us to be able to find those different communication vehicles. Next slide, please. Shirley has also effectively used these bios to not only highlight the important research that some of us do, but also to show the partnerships that are necessary for effective preservation efforts. So in this report, Jason's work at Lindenmeyer is discussed in terms of partnerships between Colorado State University, the city of Fort Collins, and Larimer County to protect the site. So in some ways, you know, what it is we have a professional archaeologist in the report who's commending the efforts of the city and of non-archaeologists in designing a sensitive recreational space where trails avoid archaeological deposits, parking lots that are hidden so visitors can experience an undeveloped landscape. And Jason spoke to Shirley about the consultation that Fort Collins Museum of Discovery did with the Northern Cheyenne, the Northern Arapaho, and the Southern Ute and Mountain Ute tribes. So again, from a science communication perspective, this is a concrete example that can be used to educate other local governments on what a successful archaeology preservation project could look like, how they might partner with other folks, other institutions, archaeologists, and tribal partners or other important stakeholders to these projects. Lindenmeyer is also a great example in this report of a site that can be used holistically and is not just for cultural or historical educational purposes, but also includes the natural environment. And so there's a whole range of public education activities that can be done to really make the past more realistic and to kind of provide a richness and a depth that traditionally we might not always see in archaeological education projects. So back to you, Matt.
All right, thanks, Holly. So again, Lindenmeyer is one of the earlier case studies in the report, and it's used to talk about Jason LaBelle's work and what archaeologists do on a regular basis. It's a good example of the wide-ranging scope of archaeological projects in the state today. So now we're going to talk about that, archaeology today, and the whole second section of the report is trying to get our hands around the whole range of activities that are out there in some organized way, so that we can then talk about the benefits of archaeology in all of those different areas. And I will say that we had a great advisory group that helped us think through and brainstorm all the different ways to categorize archaeological activities. And so you're going to see us now walk through pretty quickly some different categories of activities and just give you a flavor of some of the benefits we've identified in those different areas. First of all, it's just the preservation of sites. Y'all find sites like Lindenmeyer and work is done there. And those in themselves are an important center of activity, economic activity in large part. And that's one of the things that this report is looking at. And so we tried to look at all the different ways that money is flowing into the preservation of archaeological sites. And we looked, for example, first of all, at grant funding. And you could have grants that are coming in from the State Historic Fund. Colorado is unique in the country in having a body of money like the State Historic Fund that goes to preservation and archaeological projects. You've got a dedicated pot of money that comes from the gaming revenue in a few communities that is then set aside for these dedicated types of projects. And we looked at the SHF funded preservation projects in the other reports, but now was a chance to really focus on the archaeological oriented projects there. In addition to the SHF, which is unique to Colorado, you've got federal grants. Maybe it's Department of Defense, maybe it's Department of Education, a lot of different sources of those federal grants coming in. And then in addition, a whole range of private grants, maybe from a foundation like Betcher. So on the right-hand side, you can start to see just some of the simple ways that we've started to illustrate the different monies that are coming in. In this case, this graphic shows the federal grants left-hand side with 135 plus million in direct impacts coming in those grants, triggering an additional 167 plus million in indirect impacts as those direct dollars are flowing throughout the economy. And then finally, you've got a total impact in that category of 303. You see in the middle, the brown colors is the same types of the breakdowns, the direct, indirect, and total for private and educational grants. And then the SHF grants, State Historic Fund, are over on the right. So I don't want you to focus too much on the numbers yet and take them home, because we're all still kind of finalizing those and adjusting these clip arts as we need to based on final adjustments. But you can see the numbers are substantial. I will say that these grants are cataloged over a range of years. Most of these are 15 plus years that we've been able to total grants in these different categories. Same thing for cultural resource management and federal oversight, the 106 projects. How many hours are involved in those? What are the types of dollars involved in the administration of those 106 projects? That's a range of years that we've been looking at, and we got some pretty big numbers, as you can see, but they're actually dwarfed by the numbers associated with visiting archaeological sites. When you start to get into heritage tourism and you start to look at the numbers associated with visitors to places like Mesa Verde, or people that travel on the scenic byways, or that go to a museum, like the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. So I will say that the numbers in this category are oftentimes much larger, and they're for individual years. So you can see here on this clip art, 2019 alone, we saw a total of over $10.5 billion in direct spending from heritage tourism in Colorado. The definition of heritage tourist, according to the tourism industry, is fairly broad. It's someone who incorporates a visit to a historic site, a heritage site, as part of their trip. It could be the sole reason for the trip, or it could be part of a larger trip. So, maybe you came to Colorado just to go to Mesa Verde and just to make that trip to that site. Or maybe you came to visit, family in Pagosa Springs or Durango, and you incorporated a visit to Mesa Verde as part of that larger trip. For the tourism industry, those are both defined as heritage tourists, and so that's how we're coming up with these numbers associated with heritage tourism from the tourism industry. But generally speaking, heritage tourists they're good tourists to have economically. They tend to spend more money than other more general-oriented tourists. They tend to be better educated. They tend to stay a little bit longer. It's a subset of the tourism industry that's considered very attractive economically, and so that's something that we highlight in this part of the report. So I know we're talking at a really high level here, but we've covered two broad categories of activity: the preservation of archaeological sites and dollars flowing in there, and then also visiting archaeological sites. There's a whole additional, range of activity today when you just start looking at people and you start thinking about people that are involved in the archaeological community in some way. Maybe they're involved in one of these education programs that you see highlighted on the map on the right, a degree granting program, either a bachelor's degree or a graduate level degree, either in anthropology or archaeology. We've cataloged all those in the report, started to get some numbers of, just people that have gone through the program. You look at volunteer organizations, the Colorado Archaeological Society, and all the different branches that they have around the state, the different local organizations, and the fact that they all have local meetings. They have meetings every year where they get together and they rent rooms and they spend money and they go out to eat as part of just their regular gatherings. And there's economic activity associated with that piece of the pie as well. You've got people who have gone through the degree program. I'm forgetting the name of the certificate program right now, but the avocational archaeologists as well that have gone through and taken steps to educate themselves and contribute to the community in that way. And so we summarized the number of people that have gone through those degree programs as well. So that's all part of this, just kind of getting a sense of the scale of the economic impact. A lot of those people, a lot of those folks are getting together on a regular basis. Maybe they're meeting as part of national organizations that have periodic events in Colorado. Maybe they're meeting as part of Colorado organizations that meet annually around in the state. You can see a lot of those archaeological events on the left-hand side of the slide here on this map, and we reached out to as many of these groups as we could to try to figure out, what was your attendance? How long were you here? What do what were some of the rough estimates that we could use for how many dollars were spent by these attendees in the local or state economies? So when you look at the technical report that Holly mentioned early on, that's where we summarize a lot of this type of information. And I will say that we did a good job trying to reach out to a lot of different folks. I think we had a mediocre response in terms of getting data from a lot of the different groups. I think all the different categories that I've talked about so far, we were uneven in the level of data that we were able to collect. So sometimes we got spot on data, you know, from folks like the State Historic Fund, where we have very solid, you know, data that followed a consistent methodology over many years. And so that's a very strong part of the numbers part of the report. Other times when we were getting kind of self-reported data, like, you know, number of employees at a CRM firm, or, you know, average wages at a CRM firm, or the attendees at one of these events, or, you know, estimated expenditures for an attendee, we got fairly spotty data. And I think, you know, this is the first time we've done this. And so the report that you're going to see, it's very much kind of a collection of apples and oranges data. Some of the sections of the report are going to be more anchored in a good body of data. Some are going to be kind of more establishing a baseline moving forward. You're going to hear from Holly at the final part of this presentation that they really would like to get better data moving forward, so that all these different types of things that we're talking about can be moving from a position of really strong data. So, but that's my summary of the big categories that are covered in archaeology today, and this is a section that has a number of case studies. So I'll give it back to Holly to talk about.
Great, thanks. Yeah, back to the case studies. So like Jason and Lindenmeyer, Shirley looked at highlighting Bonnie Clark and her work at Granada in Campomache and Prowers County. And I'm really impressed by all the various aspects of this project that Shirley and Bonnie highlight in this section of the popular report. And I think this will be really powerful to communicate to lay folks about what we do and why we do it. So most of us are familiar with this site. It was a World War II Japanese internment camp where the US government incarcerated 10,000 American citizens. It's really incredibly powerful and evocative, especially since it's so close to us in time. And I think there's that connection that we don't always get with other types of archaeological sites. Next slide, please. Bonnie's work is also a really great example of what we do today as archaeologists for how she incorporates relationship building with local communities into her research and work designs. So this project has operated for 6 field seasons between 2008 and 2018. The 2020 season was postponed because of COVID. But Bonnie reported that it operates with an annual budget of $50,000 with funding from the National Park Service, the Dumbarton Oaks Research Library in Washington, D.C., the University of Denver, and the Japanese American Association of Colorado, as well as field school tuitions and private donations. So again, illustrating the importance of different relationships and partnerships in order to get archaeology accomplished in Colorado and elsewhere. In turn, Dr. Clark uses these funds for the 25% cash match for the History Colorado State Historical Fund, which is also a major funder of the project. And then crew members come from DU, Prowers County, and from multiple Japanese American community organizations. And so Shirley has this great quote from Bonnie about how the funding is also used for this relationship building with the local community. So the quote is, "Think about where your money goes. That's how you create relationships. We could buy our equipment and supplies and contract for services in Lamar, the nearest large town. It would probably be the least expensive way to go. However, we want to partner with members of the community and we want those relationships to be constructive and strong. So instead, we make our highest priority spending our money in Granada and at nearby locally owned businesses." Bonnie reported that as a rough estimate, she thinks they moved about $14,000 of project money into the local economy during just the 2018 field season. The 25 staff, students, and volunteers also spent money at local shops during their stay, as did the over 100 people who attended the 2 open house days. So again, that goes to the types of indirect spending that Matt was speaking to earlier. That they have been able, through their math magic, to quantify in the technical report, which I think is, again, a really important aspect of this for us to be communicating to outside folks. In addition, the project makes substantial contributions to the community identities of Grenada and Prowers County, and through its partnership with the Amache Preservation Society Museum. So this is just a really great case study about both those tangible and intangible benefits of archaeology. I will turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, Holly. So we've talked about who's an archaeologist as our first section. We've talked about the broad range of archaeology activities today in our second section. The third part of the report starts to look forward and starts to look at Colorado in the future and just the ways that the state's changing. And this is a structure that's intended to parallel the structure of the preservation reports that we did. You know, in the last version of the historic preservation report, we had a similar a split where we talked about preservation today and preservation tomorrow. And so this is very much History Colorado's goal here, is to try to use that same type of lens to now focus on archaeology. And so what are some of the things that we're thinking about in the future? Well, there's a broad range of things that the stakeholders, you know, suggested that we might take a look at. Some of the ones that we landed on are shown on this slide: the changing climate, effects of urban sprawl, impacts of oil and gas development, land conservation, how land conservation goals can benefit archaeology. And so the report just starts to walk through some of these issues in a little bit of detail and to give it some color. I wanted to show you another screenshot from the draft report just to show you how these case studies are being formatted to really, on the left-hand side, you can see we've got some body text that's introducing the main topic and starting to talk about changing climate, and specifically the fact that, you know, wildfires have become increasingly frequent and increasingly intense in Colorado. And then we've got a case study here with photos and some text that illustrate the Mesa Verde experience from 2020 and how some of those archaeological resources were impacted by that event. And we talk generally about how, you know, they're going to be more at risk. More resources will be put at risk through changing climate issues in the future. We talk about flooding in addition to just the wildfire risk. And so that's the way that this part of the report is organized. This is not so much a number crunching exercise as opposed to just kind of discussing broad trends. And I think another trend that we talked about is another case study. So I'll turn it back to Holly.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so one of the focuses of both of the reports is not only to kind of, you know, summarize and illustrate all the different sorts of work that we do, as well as to talk about some of the challenges like climate change that Matt was just referring to. But it also offers, potential tools and solutions to the challenges of conducting research, preserving sites, and achieving these larger goals that we all have in archaeology. So other case studies in the popular report revolve around the conservation work that organizations such as the Archaeological Conservancy do. And in this case, Shirley discusses the Haney site. Again, I think fairly familiar to many of us here, so I won't go into the specifics. But it's used as a tool to talk about how conservation easements or ownership by organizations like TAC can help fill those gaps for protections of sites on private property that state and federal laws don't always cover. So again, you know, conservation can also be tied back to the economic benefits for a local community, while also discussing the intangible reasons that we want to share these with future generations. Next slide, please. I think we had a quote. Yes. So we have lots of little bios and quotes and snippets and anecdotes throughout the report, again, to, you know, humanize and personalize all this work we do. So we have this one by Jim Walker, the Southwest Regional Director for the Archaeological Conservancy. The preservation of landscapes and archaeological sites not only enriches minds, but it can also enrich communities through heritage and archaeological tourism, which is a major contributor to Colorado's economy. We need to protect these precious pieces of the past so we can pass them on to future generations. I'll turn it back to Matt.
All right, and we are again covering this at a super high level, and so that's the segue to the final part of the report, which is moving forward. I will tell you that there's a lot of information here. The popular report is about 85 pages in its current draft, and the technical report is about 150 or so. And so there is a lot of information, and obviously Holly and I are just scratching the surface for you. But there's more that we wanted to cover, and there's more that the state recognizes that they would like to address in the future. And so the final part of the report is intended as a resource guide to help move forward. And there are sections talking about ways to try to operationalize some of the recommendations in the report, how to move forward for future study. There's a whole resource guide about places to go for grant opportunities or to learn technical assistance for some of the archaeological activities that we talk about in the different sections. Potential collaborators are identified. So there's a lot of information that is identified, as opportunities to move forward. I want to emphasize this whole issue of baseline data collection. Got some exclamation marks there, because the preservation reports have turned into an ongoing series for the state of Colorado, and that's been really valuable. And now for 20 or so years, they've had a baseline of information looking at various metrics for historic preservation activity, and they've been able to chart a consistent path forward based on that baseline. The state would like to do that for archaeology as well, and I think that this is a good start, this report, but I think it could benefit even more in the future by more robust data collection of the types that you start to see on this slide here. And a lot of words on this slide, but again, it's just starting to give you a sense of, in all the different categories that Holly and I have identified, grant funding, CRM, et cetera, starting to identify the particular metrics that would be valuable to go ahead and collect these things in a more systematic way moving forward. Again, some of this stuff is easier than others. Some of this stuff is going to be publicly available data, from History Colorado or some other group like that. Some of it's not. You get into the cultural resource management category, and you get into number of employees primarily employed in archaeology, total combined wages earned by those employees, et cetera, and annual revenues. There's going to be some concerns, about sharing proprietary information there. And I think, hopefully, as we start to get the word out about this report and kind of illustrate how it's just intended at a broad level to demonstrate broad categories of benefits, hopefully there'll be a little bit more opportunity to collect that type of data from those firms and to start to establish more of a baseline moving forward. We sent out surveys, and we didn't get great responses. We did get some responses, and we very much appreciate the people that did respond to the surveys that we sent out. But hopefully moving forward, there'll be even more room to grow. This is just some of the categories here. We've identified a lot of other categories as well. Just number of visitors in museums, cost of admission, et cetera. Again, what are potentially some of the metrics that we can start to establish to show activity? In the report, these are longer lists. We've just shown you a few of the top items here for each category, but we've got longer lists of all the metrics that could be valuable. I will say that in a specific different context, scenic and historic byways, I was in kind of a similar situation years ago with them, and they wanted to do an economic impact study, but they were suffering from the same kind of lack of data in a lot of these categories. And so they followed a similar approach. They kind of put out a call for data, and they tried to establish a broad set of metrics where they could establish baseline data collection. And that's been successful for them. They've now been able to start to build a more consistent body of information. Hopefully that'll happen with archaeology too. Holly, do you want to say anything about
Yeah,
these slides?
and you were a little bit nicer than I was. So so yeah, there was some moments of frustration in trying to get data. I think Matt and his team at Clarion just did an amazing job finding data, finding sources, crunching that data. And I'm really, really impressed with this baseline that we have gotten. The preservation report we use all the time. History Colorado has a lot of different types of communications with state legislators for different communities, different projects. We pull information from that report often and use it. That report has also been used nationally, right? So Nick Shippo and other organizations are interested in that kind of data because it helps us to advocate at the federal level and other levels for funding, for resources, or even just bipartisan support of laws like the National Historic Preservation Act, right? Which we have seen over the last few years. None of these things are infallible, right? We have to be able to communicate why what we do is important in a variety of ways to a variety of audiences to ensure that we have those support and legal mechanisms in place. So that's really our intention with this archaeological report, is to build up that same level of data so we can use it for the same types of advocacy. Groups outside of Colorado are interested in these reports when they're finalized. I've talked to SAA, SHA, again, Nick Shippo, and everyone's interested in seeing what kind of information that we're gathering, as well as the recommendations that Matt and his team have for how we can continue to take data in the future. So this is where I like beg, plead, and cajole. We need data moving forward, and we all need to be keeping like good, consistent data. So I would really like to understand from you guys, whether that's today during the question and answer period, or you know, in the future after you read the technical report and you're able to mull things over, how we can, what we can do to make gathering that data from you all a lot easier. When Matt said that we didn't get, we had a mediocre response, they sent out 180 emails for the CRM survey. The first time they sent out those 180 emails, 5 people responded. The second time, 5 more people responded. And 2 of those people were from the same company. So we have data from 9 archaeology companies. So many of you have done a lot to assist us and to move this forward. And to you guys, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. To everybody else, what the hell, guys, please give us data. So let's talk about how we get there. But I think that's all. That's my plea. We went through this. We're not too early. We finished a couple of minutes early, I think. But if you guys have questions or comments, or you want to talk about anything, I'm happy to answer those questions. Yeah, thank you to everybody. We did have a lot of communities. Our advisory committee is fantastic, and people not on the advisory committee who we have sent out drafts to help us. And I know I'm not going to remember everybody, but Richard Wilshusen, Mark Mitchell, Katie Wechter, Steve Castles, Chris Johnston, Kelly McAndrews, you know, all of you guys who have given, Dan Haas, all of you guys who have given us feedback on drafts and help work through some of this data. We really appreciate it, as well as all of the organizations. And CCPA, thank you both for giving us this huge chunk of time today to talk about this, as well as